Hi folks, it's Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio, no pictures live stream. Please listen to this presentation as you would a radio broadcast as you're driving along in your car or your truck or going along in public transport. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the economics of the mainstream media. This is the globalist controlled mainstream media, which is controlled by the globalists and their apparatchiks and flunkies and stooges all across the Western world. Now, what's interesting here is not one of these media outlets that spew endless propaganda could survive or do survive or able to survive commercially in their own right. Now, that's one thing. So none of them are economically viable. They're obviously essential tools for disgorging globalist propaganda, but in terms of commercial viability, none of them would exist without government handouts, taxpayer subsidies, huge taxpayer write-offs, handouts from the United Nations, handouts from the Bill Gates Foundation or BlackRock or whoever. So yet, in spite of their non-viability commercially, they still pay their journalists and or propagandists. I mean, they're pretending to be journalists. They still pay their journalists the big bucks as if it was a commercially viable operation, but it isn't. So we're living in they're living, and they put us in turn into this strange fantasy world where commercial viability is no longer relevant when it comes to putting out globalist propaganda. Now, everyone else has to live with commercial viability, but not these people. So just looking, I mean, in Britain, for example, if you look at the most radical activist journalists that are really heavily pushing the globalist propaganda and attacking anyone that isn't on board, journalists that are really heavily pushing the globalist propaganda and attacking anyone that isn't on board and constantly attacking Trump and Nigel Farage and so on, then they're paid, say in dollar terms and with the benefits and so on, they're paid around $500,000 plus per annum. In some cases, more than that. The sort of suburbs and places they live in are 99% white, and they're the entry level price of an apartment in some of these London suburbs they live in, the entry level price is like $2 million. Houses on acreage in these areas, the prices go up to and over $100 million. So that's the sort of place that these folks are living in. The only time you see someone who's not white, other than some super rich Brahmin or Communist Party general, the only time you see that is when someone comes to clean your swimming pool or mow your lawn or clean your house or something like that. So these people live in an absolute all-white, quite well-to-do bubble, and they insist, mass migration, no problem. Now, they're paid propagandists. Now, if you look at the following of some of these people, they're these channels and programs and the journalists that anchor them or report on them, the following isn't vast. It's in fact quite modest in the overall scheme of things. So they're clearly not being paid for eyeballs. They're not being paid for advertising revenues they generate. They're not being paid for anything other than pushing out propaganda. And there's a very coordinated system amongst the globalist mainstream media and their associated flunkies, is that they get one news outlet to say, and because they're mainstream, they're trusted news source, because one of them says something, that can then be quoted by the next one. It's been confirmed in various reports that England is awash with swastika waving Nazis everywhere. And well, no, we're not saying it. They said it. They said it's not us. They're saying it. And this type of thing, so they can re-quote each other. This is the misinformation network that supposedly is illegal if anyone else does it. It'll get you in prison if you're not part of the mainstream globalist controlled media network. So if a private individual or a small private channel, online social media channel, does anything like that, requotes what someone else said, that's it, Nazi. But these people can do it with impunity because they're all part of that same network of propaganda. Now, looking at the numbers, these news outlets are losing money by the gazillion. Their advertising revenue covers 10% of their costs. Now that means they're not viable. So in a real commercial world, they'd all be out of business. They wouldn't even exist. And yet they're being propped up again by government handouts, NGO grants from the United Nations, and all sorts of spurious sort of fictitious, made-up reasons. We have to represent the oppressed or something like that. Now, given that they're artificially propped up by, if you like, the globalist cabal, and the globalists must control the news and information narrative, because if they don't and can't, the whole globalist project is falls to pieces. It relies very, very heavily on this propaganda narrative and control of it, and their pushing of it. But none of these people or none of these media outlets would survive. Now it's costing. Yes, I mean, just look at whether it be you look in Canada, Australia, or elsewhere. None of these media outlets could survive, and there's no way they could pay those sort of bucks to journalists. You can't pay someone $1 million a year when you're losing $100 million a year. So there's this perverse economics, and this, I think, represents the economics of the globalist world order. Value is in your ability to deceive people on a grand scale, and to lie to them, and that's worth a lot. That's why you pay these people a lot of money, because they're able to. Now, how many people are persuaded by these lies is hard to say. I mean, some must be. But again, if you look at the viewership and the following of these propaganda outlets, then, well, they can't be reaching that many people. Now, something like, say, the BBC in England, or any of the public broadcasters, again, they couldn't survive without government handouts. And they're given a lot of taxpayer money, supposedly to be impartial, but they're anything but impartial. They're purely globalist mouthpieces. And again, none of them. Some of these are paid for. Now, I've met some of these journalists, and there's one in Australia that was one of the best paid, or among the best paid journalists, and I met a few of them. And this guy who's comes across actually quite well on the air, but when you're sort of sitting next to him at sort of a dinner party, one-to-one, he's nothing but a pathetic little dweeby activist. He's not. He's actually quite pathetic. He just grovels like a little child in front of women, for example, because women are so oppressed, and again, but he lives in one of the wealthiest postcodes of Australia. It's all white. He doesn't live amongst these people that he supposedly supports and defends and represents, and I'm defending the downtrodden. Well, why don't you go and live among them then, if that's your case? Why don't you have some of these downtrodden people at your house? But no, he lives in an all-white, rarefied, leftist, wealthy Marxist type attitude neighbourhood. And also as a lady who was a prominent journalist, probably not a bad interviewer in the hour, but I mean, she was good at pitting people against one another and creating controversy. If you call that a good interviewer, I don't know, but she, when you're actually sitting next to her and talking to her, she behaves like a snot-nosed sort of 16-year-old schoolgirl, not a 45-year-old woman that she was at the time that I met her, and also she's an idiot. Other than the talking points so she's got no comprehension of the issues she's talking about. And if you try and talk to her about anything, she perceives this as a kind of a threat, and you're just part of the Hitler patriarchy. If you even ask her a question, if she doesn't know the answer, which is pretty much all the time. So the quality of journalists is not high. If you say, well, a really good journalist is someone who every day says Trump is a Nazi, then that's the qualification to be a good journalist. Then I suppose with such a low bar, then maybe they do meet that criteria. But the reality you need to understand is, or come to grips with, is that none of these propaganda outlets could survive without the handouts. So the globalists are artificially propping up these media outlets for the sole purpose of they spew propaganda and hate against straight white people and white society and white culture and so on. But it also illustrates how few people actually do follow these, how few people would make up the viewing public. It was once the case with media outlets, by the way, that they would attract as many eyeballs they could with good quality news programs, good quality programming. I mean, whether you call it sensational or not, but they would attract the eyeballs, and sometimes good quality drama, that sort of thing. They would attract the eyeballs, and because they attracted the eyeballs, they could sell the airtime, if you like, on assuming a TV station or even a newspaper for that matter. They could sell the space or the airtime because, well, we get lots and lots of eyeballs coming to our our program or our newspaper, and so they could sell their advertising on the basis of the number of eyeballs they attracted. Then companies could advertise their products or services there, and they in turn would get business and so on. That was how it worked. But with the arrival of the internet and electronic media, that sort of thing, that's kind of dispersed rather than concentrated. It's dispersed the media landscape across a wider area. And also, people like myself doing tiny micro news channels. So because that concentration was lost, and because the media, the internet allows breaking news or takes breaking news away from the concentrated media outlets, they lost their viability, but they're only maintained again for their use, their propaganda value for the globalist machine. But it illustrates, I think, not only the changing economics, but the changing purpose, and also the deceit and the, I would argue, treachery that is going on in the background, where we're not being fed news at all. We're being fed subsidized propaganda and outrageous lies and narratives. But that's part of the landscape, the information landscape today. It's particularly outrageous when people like Keir Starmer or others, say, well, we have to shut everyone else down, so only our lies and narratives can be heard. I mean, for goodness sakes. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.